Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, I'm talking about the new album from the Orb, Prism. Alright, it's time once again to talk about the Orb. I've been regularly covering this band since near the very beginning of this channel's life. I've done a full discography review of them with individual videos on all 15 of their previous studio albums. Also an odds and ends video going through their side projects and the like, a top 10 tracks video, and a worst to best ranking. The playlist containing all of that will be linked in the description. I will say, in the past couple of years, we haven't exactly been starving for new Orb material. They've been keeping plenty busy since their last album came out. There have been a number of Orb offshoot projects like The Heavens by Setibus and Enter the Kettle by OSS, with supposedly even more to come. There's already a new album from their offshoot Chocolate Hills announced for, I think, this coming June. And of course, just this past March, they put out a remastered reissue of their eternally underrated 2007 masterpiece and my personal second favorite of their albums, The Dream. They gave it a full wider release on all the usual streaming services and on Bandcamp through the Liquid Sound Design label, complete with new vinyl and CD runs and related t-shirt and other merch, as you can see from what I'm wearing today. But of course, the announcement of a proper new Orb studio album was always going to be driving some level of excitement, especially since I'd heard a bit of the lead single, Living in Recycled Times, which was this crazy drum and bass mix that sounded nothing like anything else I'd ever heard out of the Orb before. All these decades in the game and still trying to push themselves, you do love to see it. Granted, there wasn't a guarantee that this album was going to be a big winner, but I have heard a lot of positive buzz around it from fans. I even saw one of my commenters tell me they thought this was already in their top 3 favorite albums from the Orb overall, which, even if I certainly wasn't going in expecting it to resonate on that strong a level, I was still just as hyped to hear what they had to offer as I would be for any new Orb album. So, I've been sitting with it for a few days now, and my final thoughts are, it's very good. I like it a lot. It's just as much fun as I would hope for a new Orb album to be at this point in their career. I don't know if I could say that I love it, though. It's very close to great, but I think it might come up a bit short of hitting that level for me. So the thing about this album is that it strikes me as basically a redo of their last album, Abolition of the Royal Familia. A lot of the same people behind the scenes, primarily Dr. Alex Patterson working with Michael Rendall, plenty of credits from the usual suspects, such as Youth, Gowdy, David Harrow, Andy Kane, The Corporal, got the same violinist from Abolition, Violetta Vici, reprising a role on a number of tracks here, and a few other names like Leandro Fresco, Jono Podmore, David Lofts, or vocalist Rachel Darcy joining in as well. And stylistically, it's exploring all the same kind of territory that Abolition was as well. Some disco and house grooves, some spacious ambience, lots of dub and reggae as always, your usual smattering of goofy vocal samples from comedy sketches and the like, and the one above mentioned drum and bass cut as mentioned before. Kinda like Abolition had one called The Queen of Hearts. Although minor spoilers, I do like this one a fair bit better. Prism is definitely a modern Orb album through and through. Now, Abolition of the Royal Familia is definitely an album that I've turned out to have a bit of a weird relationship with over the past couple of years. When it first dropped, I thought it was great and scored it a solid 8 out of 10, though it has shrunk on me a fair bit since then, and became more revealing to me as to why some people aren't as keen on the goofier side of the Orb as I was. Especially when it comes to like the reggae cuts on that one, which felt particularly corny and cheesy in a less than flattering way. And while organizing the album by genre, having all the dance tracks, all the ambient tracks, and all the reggae tracks taking up specific sections of the album was a cool, unique idea at first, the album's pacing ended up really suffering for it, making that album feel like it was really meandering and dragging in several parts. Not to mention, the album trying to pass itself off as some kind of more serious political statement through its album cover and title, and just not delivering on that promise at all. It's still a good album with a fantastic opening stretch and a really strong penultimate cut. I do still come back to it every now and then, and it still grows and shrinks on me every now and then. At the end of 2020, it had grown back on me just enough to snag an honorable mention on my year-end list that year. But it continues to be an album that, while I like, it never fully sits right with me, and I want to like more than I actually do. Probably give it like a 7.3 now. And all of this is relevant to mention because Prism explores pretty much all the exact same ideas that Abolition did. Though it is also a noticeable improvement on most of them. First and foremost, Prism completely resolves my issues with the previous album's pacing. It may be a similarly lengthy 70-minute album, but compared to Abolition, where there were a number of different tracks and sections where my attention would trail off or I would really start to feel the length, every time I put on Prism, it zips by quickly. Those 70 minutes never felt like much of a commitment at all, and they're always careful to space out and sequence the ambient, the dub, and the house elements in such a way where they feel much more balanced and show up in just the right places where they would hit the best. Not to mention, all 9 tracks here feel like important standalone moments for the album. None of them feel like filler. And heck, I'd probably say that Prism even has higher high points than Abolition, with more cuts that specifically stuck out to me. It's an all-around improvement on that album. But it also has lower low points. All 9 tracks may feel important in context and have their own identity, but I definitely did not enjoy all 9 tracks equally. The album can be a bit of a mixed bag. Now, the album does have a really strong start. H.O.M.E, High Orbs Mini Earths is a particularly expansive and impressive opener, starting out with some swirling ambience made out of various synth pads and orchestral strings, and of course the spoken narration plays on top, saying the title, listing off musical instruments that I don't think are actually playing in the song, and expressing love for the planet we live on. It already sounds totally immersive in the beginning, but that's just the intro. Around the 4-minute mark, it really starts to build up and eventually pay off into this crisp and breezy deep house groove with lots of old school house drum machines and deep and round bass line and the old Mr. Fingers Can You Feel It tradition. It's super satisfying, and the way they all sync into the same swirling ambience is so freaking nice. There's also sections where the synth textures get markedly more sharp and brittle, and a nice abstract outro where it all blends into a similar mix of ambience to where we started, with lots of sound effects of like creaking playground swing sets or something. It's an excellent start to the project, really easily pulls me in every time. And next up we get the concisely titled Why Can You Be in 2 Places at Once When You Can't Be Anywhere at All? Where's Gary mix. Gee, I wonder if this track was inspired by Getting High. Now, I'm of 2 minds with this track. On one hand, this is definitely one of my favorite tracks here. It delivers this really thick and stomping disco groove with lots of cascading synths and funky guitars going over its driving beats, with lots of sick breakdowns with these kind of airy vocal samples in the background. It's all really satisfying and danceable. It's a total banger. On the other hand, I did feel like the stoner theme of this track is, let's say, a little on the nose. Like, there are so many weed-themed tracks in the Orb catalog. I suspect at least half to 2/3, if not more, of the Orb catalog was either inspired while being high or by being high. And what do we have here? A track that starts with a sample of someone taking a puff from a blunt, and other samples appearing throughout the track that I think come from like some old Cheech and Chong comedy sketch, with some guys who are like clearly high off their minds wondering where their friend Gary is, and Gary is right there trying to get in the room with them and is locked out, but the other guys are like, sorry, Gary's not here, man. Now, sure, this kind of goofy sampling is part of what makes the Orb what they are, but it does strike me as maybe a bit too obvious. When I first heard them coming up, I was like, okay, Dr. Alex, we get it. You like weed. I was not aware of that. May not be nearly as bad as when they sampled the Snoop Dogg Smoke Weed Every Day meme on their track Wolfbane a few albums ago, and it's never so intrusive to get in the way of the actual instrumental behind everything. Again, the track is still one of my biggest favorites here, but those samples probably still did more to distract from the track than add to it. Still, that's a fairly minor complaint compared to what's to come, because next we get a ghetto love story, and oh my fucking god, this is an embarrassing clunker on the level of Wolfbane. I thought the reggae cuts on Abolition were cheesy, but they are nothing compared to this track, which delivers exactly what his title says. Regular guest vocalist The Corporal sings in his goofiest Jamaican accent yet about how he fell in love with his wifey in the hood over all these super cheerful cliche reggae arrangements. And yes, the word wifey is emphasized in the chorus of the song. You get to hear it sung multiple times. Why does nobody call her my wifey? I mean, it does come off very genuine. I can certainly believe that the Corporal loves his wife. It feels well-intentioned enough to be hard to actively get mad at as a result, but Christ, this is ungodly levels of cringe. I'm not sure if the Corporal is white himself. If he isn't, this track might be a bit more excusable, but even so, I've still never heard an Orb track that felt like it had this much old fat dancing white guy energy. The Orb, through all their escapades in the world of dub and reggae over the years, always felt really respectful and reverent of that genre and did their best to make it sound as cool as they could and nail down its original core appeal, even when making otherwise goofy tracks such as Perpetual Dawn. And that goes for other tracks with this exact same vocalist as well. The Corporal has killed it before on old Orb tracks like Lost and Found, and even appears on another much better track later on this album that I'll get to. But this track feels like gentrified COD reggae and like a parody of itself. The Orb officially passed the white corniness Event Horizon with this one. And worse still, it's also easily the catchiest track in the bunch and the one most likely to get stuck in my head. I'm not sure if it's worse than Wolfbane. It doesn't have that track's How Do You Do Fellow Kids veneer, and like that track, I was able to at least tolerate it in context with enough repeat listens. If it were just instrumental, I'd probably be okay with it in the same way I find the reggae tracks on their last album to be at least listenable. But every time I hear the word wifey being said, it makes me want to die. I just cannot excuse this track. Its presence alone prevents the album from reaching great territory for me. Though while that is the worst track on the album by a long shot, it's not the only track here that I wasn't really feeling. I also wasn't huge on the next track, Picking Tea Leaves and Chasing Butterflies. It's another really cheerful major key dub track with some standard dub percussion and bass lines, and samples of some kind of opera singer going up next to various plastic cascades of synths, a few reverby trumpets, and all these synthetic ukulele-sounding textures that sound directly pulled out of their old tracks Star 6 and 789. Those sounds in particular felt a bit, cheaply self-referential and took me out of the vibe every time they come up. I mean, the whole mix is nice and pleasant, but it is once again a bit on the overly saccharine side, and the Orb have made no shortage of tracks that sound kinda like this and do this sound a lot better. This is another track that I could probably skip over. But we know I have always defended that cheesier side of the Orb in the past, so thankfully, next up we get a cheesy Orb pop song that I think actually does really work in Tiger. This track basically feels like an improved sequel to what they were doing with Days, the opener on their last album. It's this cheerful and triumphant sounding disco pop cut with lots of impassioned vocals from regular Orb vocalist Andy Kane. The lyrics are cliche and inessential as they come, and their musings about needing to have hope and stick together, but the tunes and melodies are remarkably solid. Andy Kane is really selling it, and the instrumental and groove behind him has a lot of genuinely uplifting energy behind it. Where the last two tracks in their attempts at feel-good vibes mostly fell flat, this one does finally succeed in putting a smile on my face every time. And then if you needed the reminder that the Orb actually can do the dub reggae sound well without sounding like a white guy parody of it, next up we get Dragon of the Ocean Dogon mix. Now, I suspect that this is yet another track about weed, and that dragons are a metaphor for stoners, especially with the lines about breathing fire to get higher. But this is so much better and more evocative than Get a Love Story, and the Corporal's vocals don't come off even close to as corny here. The mix of ambient pads, Asian flutes, and synth choirs do make for a particular sense of expansive space surrounding the typical deep dub bass lines and guitars and horn sections. And the tune is pretty catchy too. The album is really starting to recover from its earlier missteps and remind me of why I became as much of a fan of this style of the Orb, I suppose. And if you were worried about the cheesiness of these kinds of tracks, you can take solace in knowing there's no more cheesiness to be found on the remaining cuts. The beginning of the end returns us to some spacey, old-school ambient techno sounds, not unlike those which were shown on the album opener. I don't think it's quite as good as the opener. There's not really any strong tune behind this track, and it could often blend in the background for me. But its mixes of standard marching techno beats and various layers of synth arpeggios and occasional acid-y textures going over a fairly monolithic set of pads do sound particularly cool together and create another nicely atmospheric experience and nail that spacey vibe that the Orb can always do so well, presented in the way that they don't often try, I suppose. And speaking of the Orb nailing sounds that they don't often try, that takes us to the above-mentioned lead single, Living in Recycled Times. And I may as well come out and say it, this is unquestionably the best track on the album. If there's any reason to hear this album, it is this track. This is the Orb's take on just a straightforward classic drum and bass style. Lots of super well-polished and smooth but still solidly banging and fast-paced beats going up next to airy vocal performances from Rachel Darcy. And anytime those filtered horn stabs come in as like lead-ups at the end of every handful of measures, it totally gets me hyped. And that's not even to get into the whole second half of the track, which falls much more towards regular ambience with lots of violin accompaniment. All of that sounds absolutely gorgeous too. It's not really the kind of track I would have been able to guess was made by the Orb if you hadn't told me. Aside from maybe the news radio announcers being sampled in the last 2-3 minutes, those could have tipped me off, but other than that, this feels like a step into fully new territory for them, and it goes over fantastically well. And then finally, all of this culminates into the closer and title track, which sticks to an entirely ambient sound that feels like it could just be a direct continuation of what they were doing with the end of the previous track. There's no violins here, just big expansive spacey pads with a few Blade Runner-style melodic lines, a few melancholy trumpet solos, and bookending itself with narrations from news announcers again. The first one talking about the chess player Bobby Fischer. Like the beginning of the end, this isn't really a track that stuck out to me as all that memorable or that I could recall the sound of aside from the particular style they decided to go with, but it's very nice and immersive as always, just consistently shifting its sound around enough to remain interesting, and expansive and satisfying enough to work well as a climactic finish to the album. It's not a Soul Planet level closer, and if The Weekend It Rained Forever were the closer of Abolition, that'd be a better ending too, but it's definitely a serviceably strong finish to this project in its own right. I'll still take it for what it is. But that's everything on Prism. Yeah, a lot of very all-over-the-place thoughts on this one. Some tracks here which knock it out of the park, and some that I just couldn't really get behind, but all of it still averages out to a very good album, which is very close to reaching greatness, if not quite getting there. I still had a lot of fun with it. This isn't top-tier Orb for me, but it isn't bottom-tier Orb either. This is on the same level for me as a project of theirs like Okie Dokie It's the Orb on Compact, which may be flawed and won't be everyone's cup of tea, but still gives me plenty of solid reasons to come back to. If I were to place it in my ranking, I think I'd put it right above that album, but below Metallic Spheres, which is a more unique and all-around well-executed moment for the Orbs catalog in my eyes. This isn't exactly a late-period masterpiece, and I don't see it being like a year-end list contender. It's probably not going to change anyone's mind on the Orb if they already have feelings pinned down. But I'm still happy to have the Orb around continuing to keep at it and deliver as much quality as we still got here. So, yeah, I'm overall feeling a 7.7 out of 10 on this. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.